Okay, very good. Well, with regards to the crisis, I think one of the things I would like to do, if you might find this useful, is to take a kind of longue durée look at the crisis. One of the problems that I've observed over the many years that I've engaged the Baltic states, but not just with the Baltic states, really in dealings with all people, is that they look at a crisis in the moment that they're in it, and then are looking for a very quick fix out of it, but they don't like to reflect too much on the causes. And if they don't look at the causes of the crisis, well, then of course that's a problem, because what happens is that they don't actually repair the crisis, and they end up ending up in a situation in which they have these recurring crises. So let me, if you'll indulge me, take a look again at how Latvia ended up in this situation. I'll at least start my narrative going back to 2004 and perhaps even going back to the late 1980s, because I think the sources of the problem go back at least that far, and perhaps even further still. Latvia in the late 1980s, well, let me back up yet again and digress here, if I may. I think the chief problem that we saw in Latvia was that it gained its independence at the wrong time. So first of all, there was a timing issue. And as we know, in life, timing is very important. Now, one does not always get to choose the timing of opportunities to seize something as important as one's independence, but nonetheless, Latvia's independence came at a time when we had a convergence of several factors which would set its economic policy quite rigidly and create a kind of path dependency from which it was very difficult to deviate. So the first thing that I think we need to consider when looking at Latvia's independence was that it occurred during this kind of long crisis of accumulation that we have witnessed in the global system the past 40 years. So thinking about the collapse of the Bretton Woods order, we had a Latvia that became independent at a time when the global system was being restructured. The rules of the game that had prevailed in West Europe after World War II were entirely different from the rules that the Latvians would inherit when they gained their independence. As you might know from your studies of development studies and political economy, one of the observations that John Maynard Keynes tendered in the 1940s, as West Europe was going to exit World War II and need to develop their economies, was that we needed to get our heads around the kind of counterintuitive idea that international trade required national development. So for international trade to occur, you needed national development. That these were not separate things to look at as two distinct or discrete ways of developing an economy, but rather they were complementary. They were not at odds with one another, yet in fact they were necessary for international trade to occur. He argued that you had to be able to make things nationally before you could have things to trade internationally. Now, why do I preface my remarks about the crisis with this? Well, because it is important to understand how Latvia deviated from this Keynesian idea of needing to have national development in order to engage an international economy. As we know, the ideas of Keynes went out of fashion by the 1970s and the 1980s, and when Latvia gained its independence, we saw the ascendancy of Milton Friedman's ideas and the idea that by entering an international environment, one could attract foreign direct investment and thereby, by having a sound fiscal policy in place, attract money which would then result in real investment in the real economy. So that's what was proposed and hypothesized and theorized at the time. And as we know, in reality, things turned out quite differently. So in the late 1980s, what did we have in Latvia? We had a place in which the port cities, in particular Ventspils, were beginning to be deployed or used for a very important function within this new structure that was emerging in the world system at this time. One in which commodities could be extracted from the Soviet space, be brought onto global markets, and thereby keep commodity prices depressed. As we know, in the 1970s, rising commodity prices created an environment of stagflation in the global system, which brought into question development paradigms which existed before that time, namely Keynesian ones. So how did the United States address this crisis, and how did Western Europe as well address this crisis? Well, they addressed it by trying to open up ever more markets. So if you could bring commodities, increasing quantities of commodities onto global markets, you could bring prices down, and this would result in an increase in economic growth as it would be fueled by cheap commodities. Now, West Europe, of course, had its own problems, chiefly with unemployment, and it was seeking areas in which to place its consumer goods. So it was looking for new markets for those. And the Maastricht Treaty, which was put in place in the early 1990s, was complicated. On one side, it was seen as a way to eventually create a Eurozone, which could create an alternative reserve currency to the dollar. But on the other side, it was stalling economic growth opportunities in Europe, thus increasing unemployment, and opening up the space to the east could provide a way of mitigating those unpleasant side effects of this medicine, so to speak. So again, how does Latvia fit into all of this? Well, Latvia would be the place in which you would have oil and metals flowing to points west, where emerging oligarchs could make huge amounts of money on the arbitrage, as we know, between the state prices that they were securing these commodities at and the global prices at which they could sell oil and metals. This has particular relevance today. As we know, President Zatlers in Latvia just went on television to announce that he was dissolving the Latvian parliament, the Saima, as a consequence of 3 chief oligarchs who have gained this undue influence over the Latvian economy and state. This is directly connected to the forces which I'm addressing right now. So in Latvia, you had not only the importance of, as they would say in real estate, location, 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 in terms of a set of port infrastructure to get the wealth of the interior of the former Soviet Union out onto global markets, but also you had the beginnings of a financial infrastructure which could deal with the huge amounts of capital which would have to be moved both in and out in order to accomplish this. Now, this created the rather unusual situation which we see in Latvia today, where for a country of 2.2 million people, you have over 20 banks, and in the 1990s, of course, and especially in the early and mid-1990s, you had over 100 banks. What were these banks doing? Well, they weren't banks in the traditional sense of the term. They were banks which dealt with foreign accounts and their purpose was to, frankly, launder money. So this was a specialization, a niche that Latvia developed in the global economy. Now, this is what permitted, in effect, the Latvian economy to survive as it deindustrialized. Now, deindustrialization and or underdevelopment in Latvia was permitted again to go forward as a consequence of developing this offshore infrastructure, which provided some no insignificant measure of capital to help sustain the country. Unfortunately, as we know, finance typically doesn't create a lot of jobs, so while a lot of money flowed into Latvia, it hardly created a full employment situation. Now, let me match up that kind of structural background with what was happening on the ideological front. As we know, ideology typically serves power. As Henry Kissinger once nicely articulated, he said that the job of intellectuals is to articulate the consensus of the powerful better than the powerful can do themselves. If one does this, you will find yourselves getting very nice grants and living quite well and invited to some very nice parties. Periodically, I play that game and get all of those benefits. I recommend that you do so as well, within reason. Now, in 1990, there was a gentleman, Juris Viksnīņš, who I've had coffee and drinks with. He's a very nice man. Well, not always nice, but sometimes nice. He's quite smart. He's quite funny. And so he's a good dinner conversationalist. He is a professor emeritus of economics at Georgetown University. How does he fit into this story? He's a central figure for understanding how Latvia's economy got to where it is today. And I'll detail this shortly here. Juris Viksnīņš was part of that Latvian diaspora, so his family was forced to leave or elected to leave in 1944. And he always dreamed of a return to Latvia and imposing a kind of Milton Friedman program for the Latvian state. So some of you, perhaps, maybe have read Naomi Klein's book and you're familiar with this idea of kind of a tabula rasa on which you can write an entirely new economic program. Well, Juris Viksnīņš got that in Latvia. He got that in Latvia. He was a very talented organizer. He was a very talented organizer. In fact, he very much admired the Bolsheviks in this regard in terms of their organizing ability. And Juris began to mentor a group of young, bright, talented Latvians who would go on to run the, to use, I guess, some Bolshevik terminology, the commanding heights of the Latvian economy and state. And who were these people? Well, they were two physics students, Mr. Godmanis, who went on to become prime minister twice, both the first prime minister of the country and the person that was given power again in 2008 when Latvia experienced its most recent crisis. It's been through many. Mr. Ainars Repša, who has held any number of important posts in the country, all of them, frankly, at one time or another. He's been the head of the central bank. He's been the head of the Ministry of Finance. He's been the prime minister. He's essentially been a constant presence in terms of the running of the economy.